I'll just let you kind of give your introduction, who you are, who you're with, and maybe just a little fun fact about yourself.
Okay, fair enough. My name is Lorne McConachie. I'm a principal emeritus with Bassetti Architects, now a studio of HMC. Been working in the school environments for 30, 35 years, designing projects. I'm here because we were shortlisted for the McConnell, and so we didn't win, but a great school did, and I'm pleased to be part of the discussion.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'm sure we'll probably get into that in this second question here. But I got to ask, you said you're here because of that. Is this your first LearningSCAPES, or have you been to? Okay,
This
okay,
is many LearningSCAPES have been presenting here, and actually, a number of our projects have received McConnell recognition. So
awesome,
it's part of the fun of trying to design good schools and make sure kids are the focus. So
awesome, awesome. Yeah, we'll dive into our first question. Just kind of high level. When you hear the term radically student centered, I don't know if you've heard kind of that being used. It's kind of the theme for the conference here this year. But we're asking everybody, how do you kind of interpret that in your own mind? How would you define that?
when I first read the term, I came back to the word personalization. A number of years ago, we were defining guiding principles for varying projects, and one of the key elements was personalization for kids. How do we let each learner, each learning style, each personal need, each social emotional challenge that we face with our many kids, many learners, to emerge, to be recognized, to be counted? And so I think the goal is what's best for kids. So let's make sure it's personal. Let's make sure each child coming to school, whether they're happy, healthy, or traumatized and struggling, has their voice, their opportunity to be recognized and find a path toward exploration and learning. So
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like everybody we've talked to kind of has some sort of spin kind of where you're at, but I love that you use the word personalization. That's the first time we've kind of heard that.
okay,
So
well,
that's
good.
that's awesome.
We'll
So
throw that into the mix.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Maybe this can kind of even tie into our next question can kind of tie into the project you mentioned that was up for the McConnell Award, asking how do you move the conversation from what adults want to what best serves students? Maybe there's an application or an example you can share there, or maybe it's more general. But we kind of want to kind of hear from your perspective, keeping it radically student-centered, that personalization. If you're getting, other feedback from adults of like, no, 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 we want it this way, we want it this way. How are you kind of turning that and saying we're going to do this because it's best for students?
At the end of the day, it's not our call as designers. It's our challenge to facilitate that discussion. One of the best tools we've used in many projects is to develop guiding principles. And guiding principles, I like to call them motherhood and apple pie. Who amongst us doesn't want safety for our kids? Who amongst us doesn't recognize flexibility as an important pathway forward? Who amongst us doesn't feel like every learner, personalized learner, needs a path forward? The challenge is when we then apply those. What does that mean? Well, that means that I, as a teacher, may not get my priority over how my space is used because it needs to be flexible for many teachers. It means that I, as a teacher, may not have a student locked into a classroom for 6 hours a day because personalization means how do I, as a kid, relate to a caring adult? And it may not be the teacher that they're assigned to this year. It may be part of a team of teachers that makes that connection. So I think by developing guiding principles, these big ideas that we value, keep coming back to and check the design against, we're able to reach for big values, important goals that challenge the assumptions and some of the, I'll call it nostalgic gravity. A friend of mine uses that term, that we fall back into these patterns that we're so used to. For years, we've tried to not use the term classroom because a classroom's so loaded as just a word and comes with, gee, I was in a classroom when I was a kid, and yet it's about a learning journey for a child, not locked in a space. It's about the interaction, the collaboration, the engagement, not simply what I'm regurgitating.
Yeah.
So I think guiding principles has been the tool. And of course, that comes with a lot of facilitation, working with leaders, learners, teachers, and of course, ultimately a design.
Sure. Well, that's great. That's a great perspective there. So, kind of leading into the next question then, how do you kind of see your work specifically with this kind of approach over the next 5-10 years? Where do you kind of see it evolving to?
Well, I'm retired, so my work is probably more in the consulting and helping my former firm. But where I see the work really moving is continuing to look at what are the tools necessary for success within the 21st century. One of the things I haven't mentioned at this point is a sustainable pathway forward. How do we model good understanding of climate and of the planet as we think about what's best for kid, radically student-centered? Our children, our grandchildren are inheriting a world that is not as healthy as it needs to be. And so part of a pathway, for example, as a guiding principle might be sustainability or phrases that touch on better planet care. And so the way we build a building is changing. I mean, already within our practice, we're using a lot of timber and wood product, much more so than when I was working 20, 30 years ago, because we're trying to model a characteristic that has a lower carbon output and, aspects of good ecological practice, but also as a learning tool for the kids who are attending this and learning the stories of what better maintenance of our planet is about, as an example.
Yeah. So I got to ask then, is that you mentioned you're retired, maybe dipping into consulting? Is that kind of where you expect maybe that to kind of get into, or do you have that kind of defined?
I'm still working with my former firm. We actually just recently published a book about trauma. I got into trauma-informed design as part of the journey through the pandemic and watching kids, working with kids in Zoom meetings and recognizing some kids are doing great, happy, healthy home life. Other kids are deeply troubled, probably hungry, clearly not in an ready for engagement aspect. And school for them may have been an escape, a happier place than some of the abuse or challenges they were dealing with in their homes. So we started writing about trauma and recognizing that there are design patterns that support or that mitigate against triggering and re-traumatization. But, that's, again, that's a whole nother topic and of how do we create healthy spaces for our children. And part of that is in that personalization, that flexibility, any number of these, safety being an obvious concern that has to do with the violence-prone culture that we are finding ourselves in America.
Yeah. Well, all great perspectives there. We thank you for being part of the discussion here this week, and I'm sure we're going to kind of hear, probably even in the show notes here, we'll kind of have your school that you worked on that you mentioned earlier kind of listed there in the show notes. So thank you so much for being on.
You're very welcome. Enjoy.